So the first kind of point of departure for all this is the recognition that there's a lot of psychological variation around the world. And as I mentioned, the populations typically studied by laboratory experimentalists, including psychologists and economists, are unusual when placed in a global perspective along lots of dimensions. So I put some global maps up of dimensions: individualism and in-group, out-group trust, which, as some of you may know, have already been linked by other research to economic outcomes, things like innovation and GDP and things like that. So as a point of departure, now this psychological variation can, if I'm talking to economists, I talk about varying beliefs and preferences. So, preferences have to be endogenized in this point of view, and we already have lots of evidence that they vary across societies. So the question is going to be, how do we explain that variation? But if I was talking to cognitive scientists, which I sometimes do, I could talk about variation in people's attention, memory, perception, reasoning styles, and decision biases. So something like the kinds of economic decision-making biases that you might find in Thinking Fast and Slow, the ones we know about actually already vary. So we already have reason to think that those heuristics vary across societies. If you show people visual illusions from different societies, they vary in their susceptibility such that some things aren't illusions in some populations, and they are in others. So just a lot of psychological variation. I was thinking this morning that I've actually been going on about this for quite a while. So in the year 2000, I published this paper in the American Economic Review, and then followed up with this team project in which we conducted behavioral games in 15 societies and various. So this point has been on the table for a while. The more interesting thing for today is, how do we explain this psychological variation? So we have this variability, how do we do it? I'm going to be making the case today that our psychologies adapt ontogenetically over time as we grow up in different places to the institutions and languages and technologies that are common in that society. And that we need to understand how these institutions, languages, and technologies evolve. Although I'm going to be focusing on institutions today. And then thinking about the implications of this psychological variation. So if populations have different psychologies, policies and formal institutions may operate very differently depending on the psychology of the population. You can also use this, and this is what I do in The Weirdest People in the World in the book, is ask questions like the European expansion. So after 1500, Europeans and many of their institutions and practices like formal education expand all over the world. And how is it that we can explain the expansion of this population relative to other populations? So a simple way to put a sharper point on it is why did the conquistadors led by Cortez conquer the Aztec Empire, and the Aztec Empire didn't conquer Charles V in Spain? The other way to think about this is, why is the commercial practices, the laws, the legal institutions that arose in the West, why are they distinct when looked at in a global perspective? Well, and then finally, the Industrial Revolution. So why did that occur here? So understanding psychological variation may give us insight. Now, this slide is just meant to give folks a sense of the kind of approach I take. So I'm not taking the typical economics approach. I'm really coming from the point of view of evolutionary biology and thinking about how natural selection and our phylogeny as apes can have our psychology has evolved. And in particular, I'm interested in humans as a cultural species. So more than any other species, humans are reliant on acquiring a large body of information, of techniques, of skills from the previous generation. And so we've come to rely on that we're obligate cultural learners. This makes us different from other species. And then we can, let's see here. And this is a rigorous program in the sense that it's formally modeled. So there's a large class of formal models that help us understand these aspects of psychology. And then there's cultural evolutionary models, which help us understand tool complexity and social norms and institutions and languages. These are the products of cultural evolution that are ultimately rooted in this capacity for cultural learning. And then finally, there's enough evidence to know that these things affect things like visual processing, self-regulation, pro-social motivations, our numerical cognition, so the kinds of things that cognitive scientists study, and spatial cognition. So for example, I'll just give you one example. The practices of daily devotions or rituals is known to affect self-regulation. So if you have variation across populations in ritual practice, you're going to get differences in self-regulation. And then the other thing about this approach is that it tries to get rid of this dualistic thinking that we sometimes have, where we think of sort of culture and minds on the one hand and genes and biology on the other. What we know from cultural neuroscience and other work is that when people learn things culturally and grow up in different societies, they come to have different brains. So a simple example here is learning to read. Some populations learn to read, some don't. Traditionally, almost no one learned to read. But when you learn to read, you get a thicker corpus callosum. That's the information highway that connects your left and right hemisphere. So these cultural differences are instantiated in brain differences. All right, then the long-term picture is that this then feeds back and affects natural selection, but that's not really very relevant on the time frames we're talking about. So here I'm thinking about norms and institutions. Now within economics, there's this unfortunate dichotomy between cultural and institutional approaches. And the approach I'm taking here actually unifies those, and it makes it seem very unnatural and sort of awkward to have the distinction. So from this perspective, and there's quite a bit of theory on this, that social norms arise spontaneously once you have individuals that are heavily reliant on cultural learning and learning from others. So once you can acquire a behavioral practice, it might be cooperation in house building, or it might be not eating a certain food, a food taboo. And then the standards for judging others, people who don't do that or do that are good or bad or should be interacted with or not. You get these self-reinforcing stable equilibria, and we call those social norms. It's a group level trait. These kinds of things, you can stabilize cooperation, but all kinds of other things. And then from this perspective, institutions are just collections of social norms that govern a particular domain. So take an institution like marriage, it's composed of a whole bunch of social norms, which prescribe the obligations of the people involved, the obligations of the families in some case, rules about where the couple can live, the spousal number, characteristics of the spouses, and those will be important later. And then finally, we can think of formal institutions as just rules or organizations built on top of these norm giving. So just formalizing these things like writing constitutions. Okay, now, interestingly, until recently, I guess, economists haven't been particularly interested in kin-based institutions. But when anthropologists have spanned out around the world over the 20th century and into the 21st century, we find that lots of societies, kin-based institutions are the primary institution, the most important thing going on in people's lives. And there's reason to think they're probably the oldest of human institutions. Now, I've made the case that these are particularly strong and powerful institutions in the human case because they're anchored in features of our evolved psychology. In fact, features of psychology that we share with other apes. So like other animals, including other apes, we have a kin psychology where we are kind of altruistic towards other members of our social group. But that altruism can be extended and harnessed through social norms to create kin networks and kinship systems, which anthropologists have documented. We also have a pair bonding instinct. So this is what brings males and females together for the purposes of bonding children. And this has been built on by cultural evolution to create marriage systems, and it's in particularly in-laws. So humans are kind of unique in having powerful in-law relationships, but that depends on the institution of marriage, but it's ultimately rooted in something we share with gorillas. So this kind of teaming up for the purposes of rearing offspring. And then finally, like other primates, we have to deal with inbreeding. So we have an incest aversion that seems to apply to primary relatives. That's that disgust feeling that you think of with sex with mom or dad or siblings. But that's been extended in lots of societies to have incest taboos, which apply to it can apply to cousins or other kinds of relatives. And so this helps structure, it structures fundamental human networks. So who interacts with who, and these descend through time. So this is a powerful institution. And like I said, it was probably the first institution. So reconstructing ancestral human societies before the origins of agriculture, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that these had extensive kin networks that expanded out over space. They were bilateral, so they tracked descent through mom and dad. That turns out to be unusual in global perspective. They're based on reciprocity and ritual, and they maintain these kind of dispersed networks of hunter-gatherers. And then once agriculture evolved, societies evolve in a variety of different directions. But one direction that's common is the construction of unilineal clans. So these are actually tracking descent through only one parent, and that creates a corporate group that has fewer conflicts of interest than bilateral kinship. And there's a bunch of other norms which appear here that help create this kind of solidarity at the group level, including ancestor worship and common ownership, things like that. And then from this, there's a whole bunch of ways to go to kind of scale things up. So there's competition amongst groups, and groups that are better able to pull people together as a corporate political unit are going to succeed. And so one is age sets, which Nathan has studied, segmentary lineages, also introduced by Nathan, I believe, and simple chiefdoms. So this is these power descending down the hereditary bloodline. And this seems to be at least according to the anthropologists and archaeologists, the only pathway that you get to states. So there's lots of different trajectories, but this is the state pathway. And so you get social stratification appearing here. Now there's lots of other pathways, which I won't get into today, but there are these prestige-based systems. Now, importantly, if you want to think about pre-modern states, which is what we're, kind of a focus, all these pre-modern states, before the emergence of what we think of as modern states in Europe, are based on complex kinship. So at the elite level, elites are networked together through kin relationships. And in the lower strata, people are also networked together. So kinship forms the basic productive unit. People have a web of obligations. There's the social security system. And they're also, the people who take care of you if you're injured. People have a corporate responsibility. So if your brother commits a crime, you might be in trouble, and arranged marriage, things like that. So that's networks this. And the state institutions are really a kind of interface between the elite strata and the lower strata that has impersonal quality. So usually it's military or religious. Now, the argument is that there's no nice pathway from these pre-modern states to modern states, that you kind of had to tear all this apart in order to create modern states. And that's the case I make in The Weirdest People in the World. And to give you a quick sketch of the argument in The Weirdest People in the World for how that happened, I'm going to focus on this, how psychology changed over time. And now in my story, there's a first mover, and it's a particular strain of Christianity. So what eventually evolves into the Roman Catholic Church. I make the case that those powerful kinship systems that dominate so much of human society, both in the lower and upper strata, even in pre-modern states, demolishes the kinship networks of European societies, eventually breaking them down into monogamous nuclear families. And then I'm going to show you some evidence that this variation in kinship would have affected people's psychology and altered how they think about the world. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on this today, given our short time, but the argument is that with these kinship-based institutions suppressed, people had to build other kinds of institutions. So for example, they had to insure themselves in old age and against injury. So they began to form voluntary associations. So what you see in the late middle or in the high Middle Ages appearing are guilds, monasteries, charter towns, and universities, where people are joining as individuals to a voluntary group. And crucially, these voluntary groups begin competing. So I think competition amongst voluntary, keyword there, voluntary associations, can affect people's psychology. Just to give you a contrast, clans are not voluntary. You're stuck in whatever clan you're born into, pretty much. I mean, there is some adoption, but. And this led to rising urbanization. So Europe passes China in urbanization around 1200. There's more freedom of movement between occupations, and I make the case that affects psychology. This leads to the rise of impersonal markets. So the commercial revolution is going strong in the high Middle Ages, and I think that affects people's psychology. There's now quite a bit of work on that. And then finally, I'll make the case that the weirder psychology leads to what we think of as the basic institutions of modern states. So representative government, financial markets, economic growth, innovation. And I put Protestantism in there just because that's often taken to be a cause. And I do think Protestantism has effects, but we need to explain Protestantism as this incredibly individualistic centered religion, which is very strange in a global and historical perspective. So that's the broad outlines. I'm going to only be able to focus on these two for today. And to get us into this, depending on your background, the kinds of families you're familiar with, I want to show you that they may be unusual in a global perspective. So this is data from this ethnographic atlas that anthropologists compiled in the 1960s. And this just shows 5 common kinship traits. So you'll see the first one there, bilateral descent. Only 28% of societies have tracked descent through mom and dad. That means all the other societies are doing something else. Possessing little or no cousin marriage. So 75% of societies, cousin marriage is okay and not uncommon. Monogamous marriage, even rarer. So 85% of societies allow high status males to take additional wives. Nuclear families, even rarer. 92% don't have nuclear families. And neolocal residence. So 95% of societies don't have neolocal residence. So if we add all those up, just keep a counting of these weird kinship practices, we find that the majority of societies, so 50.1%, have 0 of these traits, and then very few have all 5. If we dig into the societies that have 5, they're either European descent societies or places that Christianity got to really early. So in the Philippines, Magellan washes up there and starts immediately complaining about the high rates of polygyny that he sees. And so by the time the Europeans arrive, to anthropologists and whatnot, to document the kinship systems, they already have monogamy and other kinship practices. And the same thing's true in North America. Now, families are a good place to start because these are the first institutions that children encounter when they enter the world. So if we're imagining an institution that shapes people's minds, it's going to be the family, right? Okay, now to give you a sense of how, so incentives and constraints are really important in this picture, because the picture here is that you need a mind that is calibrated to navigate the institutional world and the social networks that you encounter. So just to create a kind of dichotomy, an intensive kin-based society and a society with weak and mobile kinship where you only have monogamous nuclear families or individuals. On the intensive kinship side, most of your relationships are given at birth. You have a large number of roles and responsibilities, things you have to do. Part of what's seen as being a good person or a kind of a well thought of person is to live up to those responsibilities. You also get some privileges, but those depend on living up to your responsibilities. Meanwhile, in the world of weak mobile kinship, you're in a marketplace for relationships. You don't have very much from your family because it's just a small monogamous nuclear family. So you have to cultivate dispositions and attributes that make you someone that others would want to have a relationship with, whether that's a spouse, a friend, or business partner, those kinds of things. So you're cultivating things like trustworthiness and loyalty and intelligence, things like that. So in the world of intensive kinship, you're going to seek new relationships, say business partners, through your existing network. So the most trustworthy person is someone who's connected to you through multiple lines of kin relationships. In the other world, you can't do that because the kin relations are too sparse. So you have to seek people based on these personal attributes, trustworthy, and mutual interests. In the intensive kinship world, trust is based on embeddedness, having lots of those connections, whereas here it's more dispositional. Finally, shame and guilt. So anthropologists have distinguished shame and guilt for a long time. So shame societies, intensive kinship societies, individuals are concerned about maintaining face, not losing face, kind of how the social world views you. Whereas in small kinship societies with weak kinship, guilt is much more prevalent. And that's that bad feeling you get when you fail to live up to your own personal standards. Now, those personal standards may or may not be shared by the wider society because they're part of your cultivating this uniqueness. So for example, you might feel guilt if you didn't go to the gym when you wanted to, but your neighbors don't really care if you go to the gym. All right, and then so your identity here is your relationships and networks, and your identity here are these individual accomplishments and attributes that you've cultivated. So think about psychological traits that help you navigate that world. And just to give you an example of an intensive kinship society that is in the news these days, so the Taliban are basically a Pashtun organization in Afghanistan, and the Pashtun have patrilineal inheritance of both identity and land down the male line. They have high rates of cousin marriage, so over 50% by some estimates. They have polygyny. So leaders of the Taliban, for example, all have 3 wives. The clans form a segmentary lineage system, which comes with its own interesting cultural pattern associated with honor. And so that affects people's behavior, and they have corporate ownership. And so that affects, the argument is that affects how people think and how other kinds of institutions function. Now, a key question in my account is, when did European kin groups dissolve into monogamous nuclear families? We know this is clear, or at least the evidence is pretty strong, I think, that this happened before the economic expansion. So it's not something that can be argued to be a product of rising wealth. And myself now, and building on work of historians and anthropologists, have argued that it's this church's marriage and family program. So the church began a systematic effort with policies and taboos that eventually break these kinship systems down into monogamous nuclear families. So just to tap your intuitions, if you think about the English phrase for affines, in-law, what the in-law means is in canon law. So every time you refer to our affines, we're actually kind of pointing back to the process that led to all this. So sister is in canon law, and that's telling you that you should think of her like your sister, which means no sex or marriage, right? So it's tapping your incest aversion intuitions. In lots of societies, you would marry your sister-in-law. You might marry her if your wife died, or you might take her as a second wife if you're man. Okay, so another place where you can see this harking back is if you've been to a Christian wedding. At some point, the preacher or minister will say something like, if anyone here can show just cause why this couple cannot be lawfully joined together in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. That's actually an incest inquest. And it began in the Carolingian Empire. And it was a chance to get everyone together and do one last check. Is there any chance these two are cousins? Let's ask everybody who might know. And then if you all agree, then we're good. All right, so eventually what becomes the Catholic Church gets rid of cousin marriage out to 6 cousins. Now later in 1215, it contracts it back to just third cousins, but it does eventually go out to 6 cousins around the year 1000. And that's of course so far out that nobody can really track it. So it's basically saying anybody who you might possibly relate it to is out. Of course, it bans polygamy. Polygamy had been common. Celtics had polygamy, and no sex slaves, and no arranged marriages. So that point in the ceremony when the bride says, "I do," is an effort to get rid of arranged marriages, so that you want to at least get a verbal public statement from the bride on this. And the church discouraged corporate ownership of land and collateral inheritance, which meant you could buy and sell land and you could bequest land to the church. A lot of this is pointed out in this book by the anthropologist Jack Goody, but other historians like Michael Mitterrand and within economics, Avner Greif have emphasized these things. Okay, so empirically, we set up our problem like this. We need to relate the church's marriage and family program to kin-based institutions, so these things that I've been talking about, like cousin marriage and polygyny. If this idea is correct, we need to be able to connect these institutions to weird psychology, and then we should be able to do this as well. So that's one of the empirical challenges, or the main empirical challenges I'll talk about. So to do this, this is work with Jonathan Schultz and Duman Barani Rod and Jonathan Beecham. We went to the Ethnographic Atlas, which I mentioned earlier on, has been widely used in economics, and we created a kinship intensity index. And if we plot it, there's some things one has to do in order to come up with this plot, but this allows us to plot around the globe and get a kinship intensity index for all these ethno-linguistic populations around the world. Somewhere around 2016, Ben Anke and I had beers at a local pub in Cambridge, and I laid all this out for Ben, and Ben went off and wrote this excellent paper in the QJE, which is semi-independent from the work of Schultz and I, and came up with largely the same answer. So there's kind of independent convergence here. And then we also gather data on cousin marriage. So we have data on actual cousin marriages from around the globe, and we have dispensation requests, which I'll use in Europe. So this is all getting the kind of variable we want to use, the independent variable we want to use to predict psychology. And then we're also going to need variations of the church's marriage and family program to see if we can explain the variation in kinship using the church. So there's lots of psychological concepts we looked at, but just to give you a sense of some of them, we're going to be looking at individualism and independence. So if the idea is correct, we should see that greater church exposure or less kinship intensity is associated with greater individualism and independence. We should see less conformity and obedience, greater impersonal prosociality. So by impersonal prosociality, I mean the kinds of things one measures in a typical behavioral experiments game. So trust in strangers, cooperation with strangers, or measures on something like the generalized trust question. Less particularistic or relational morality. So here we're actually looking at the work of psychologists John Haidt and Jesse Graham and drawing on them, and Ben Anke does some nice work on that. And then greater use of intentionality and moral judgments. That's probably not something you've heard of, made a big deal about in economics, but I just put it in there because I think that it kind of suggests how law might be different in societies that think about the world in this way. It places a greater emphasis on intentions. You differentiate between first-degree murder and manslaughter. There's a bunch of distinctions that some societies don't make. And then finally, we're going to use laboratory experiments. That gives us precision and control. Survey measurements, that's going to give us big samples. And then ecologically embedded measures, that's going to make the case that this stuff matters in the real world. survey members could be cheap talk, and laboratory experiments might be too artificial to be important. Okay, so let me just briefly draw on this paper that we published in Science, where we first show a bunch of cross-national analyses. That's because we want to show it's global, and we want to show it with the most number of variables. So we have 17 different psychological measures there. Then we zoom in and we compare regions within European countries. And so that allows us to show the variation and test the effects of the church that had differing amounts of presence in different parts of Europe. I'll make use of second-generation immigrants there. And then we'll zoom in on Italy further and try to explain variation among Italian provinces. All right. So I'm always, I know economists don't like cross-national regressions, and they're suspicious of them, which of course you should be. But I just wanted to show some to give you a sense of the global variation. So this is from a 2008 paper by Benedict Herman, Christian Thoney, and Simon Gexter. And so it's a public goods game that's repeated for 10 rounds. This is the first round of contributions. We can also look at total contributions. This is the game without punishment. And I like the first round because it's before people have kind of seen what others do in the game. And what we can show is that greater kinship intensity means lower contributions on round one. So everybody's a university student here. The stakes are measured using purchasing parity. So same stakes in each place. And you still get this variation, correlation of 0.7. Same thing with cousin marriage. So those are two proxies for kinship intensity. And then finally, church exposure. More centuries under the church is associated with more higher offers in the first round in the public goods game. Now, here you can see this dotted line. That's the Eastern Church. And what we argue is that the Eastern Church had a kind of marriage and family program light. So what we consistently see are weaker effects when we look at the Eastern Church. Okay. Now, what's interesting here, I like this too, because there's a treatment effect. So when you add punishment to this game, the typical result, think Fair and Gactor 2000. It's actually right next to where my article is in 2008. Punishment increases cooperation, but it turns out that only works in societies with low kinship intensity. If you have high kinship intensity, people get punished, and the person gets punished tries to punish the punisher back, and you've got a feud basically. And of course, it's anonymous, so you can't tell who punished you, but you can guess based on their contributions. So the same treatment gets different effects in different places. All right, now does this matter in the real world? So just one bit of data: anonymous voluntary blood donation. So if you're a behavioral economist, maybe this is like a dictator game or a public goods game. So voluntary blood donations across different countries, greater kinship intensity means fewer of those. Same thing with cousin marriage, you can see in the middle plot there, and then church exposure tells the same story. So greater church exposure, more voluntary blood donations per capita, with a weaker effect in places under the Eastern Church. Now here we can, we threw the usual array of control variables. You can see one of Nathan's favorite variables, ruggedness there, and distance to waterways. And even if we control for religiosity and religious denominations, we get the same thing. Okay. All right, and just I don't want to spend a lot of time on the cross-national stuff, but just if we create an aggregate score of all of our 17 variables, we get this plot here in the upper right. So more cousin marriage, we also could put in kinship intensity, means a less individualistic and impersonal psychology across all this. Up in the upper left corner, more centuries under the church means less cousin marriage. So the church does seem to be having the expected effect on cousin marriage. And then finally, in the middle there, more centuries under the church means a quite more individualistic and impersonal psychology when you're under the Western Church, and a bit less when you're under the Eastern Church, so half the effect. Okay, now zooming in on Europe and trying to get rid of some of the things that might jeopardize a causal inference, we created, this is mostly Jonathan Schultz, created a database of bishoprics. So we have a GPS location and the date, and then we're able to track, and you can see here that as the church is spreading across Europe, close it out at 1500. So using this, we can take each region of Europe and say the number of centuries that it was under a bishopric, if we assume the bishops are imposing the marriage and family program. So you get this kind of map. Crucial here is that we didn't count the time that bishoprics were in a place if it was under a political power unfriendly to the bishop in Rome, to the Pope. So southern Spain is out of that for a long time, and so is southern Italy, because they're under Islamic powers, or they're under the Orthodox Church, or under Byzantine power. And eventually I'll show you, I won't show it to you, I'll make reference to an analysis of just Eastern Europe, where you get basically the same answer. So in the interest of time, I don't want to spend a lot of time going through the psychological dimensions, but we went to the European Social Survey and we created measures from the survey questions for conformity and obedience using 4 different questions, creating an index. We used 2 questions to create a measure of individualism and independence. So you can see one of the questions there. And we use single questions for impersonal fairness and impersonal trust. So this is the trust question that you're all familiar with. All right, and then the question is, what do we get when we see if our measures of church exposure can predict those? So this panel is a little bit complex, but I wanted to get everything on one panel. So we have each of our 4 parts of psychology for which we have measures for. And then those are regressions. So there's 10 models estimated the same for each feature of psychology. And then these just gives you a sense, the bottoms gives you a sense of our controls. So you can see we have pretty robust results. So greater church exposure means more generalized trust, more generalized fairness, less conformity and obedience, more individualism, independence. If you look at models 8, 9, and 10, you can see there it holds, even if we hold religious denomination constant. So comparing Catholics and Catholics, it matters when the bishopric got there. We can hold education, income, and employment constant there in model 9. And then what we think of is the sort of before this process started, so the population density in 500 CE. Okay, now I could show you evidence that the Western Church's duration of exposure to the Western Church predicts the frequency of cousin marriage in Europe in the 20th century. But I'll go right to the aspects of psychology that are important. So these are our 4 aspects of psychology. We found cousin marriage data for, basically the mid-20th century in 68 regions of Europe. And so we're plotting the prevalence of cousin marriage against these psychological measures. And more cousin marriage means higher conformity and obedience, less trust and less impersonal fairness, and less individualism and independence. Now you can see we have Italy, Spain, and France on there. And then we added Turkey. And what's interesting, what's fun about Turkey, it's the hinge between Europe and the Near East. And it, it falls right on the place on the plot where you'd think it should fall based on the amount of cousin marriage as our proxy for kinship intensity. Now, let's see, individualism independence doesn't stand up to country fixed effects. So if you're thinking about, what if we put this through the ringer here and put in lots of controls, country fixed effects knock out individualism independence. All the other ones hold up to country fixed effects, and particularly impersonal trust and impersonal fairness hold up to the full barrage that we were able to throw at the science paper. But it is a small sample. All right, now we also use this technique common in economics now of using 2nd-generation immigrants. So using that same European Social Survey, we extract out over 10,000 2nd-generation immigrants. And using a variety of techniques, we assign them to a kinship intensity index based on where their parents came from. So we could use the country of origin, or we use the language to figure out the ethnic group, and we attach them to the KII for that. And what we find is that we see this even among 2nd-generation immigrants. So when we attach them to a kinship intensity index from the home country, we find that, lower KII means greater trust, greater impersonal trust, greater impersonal fairness, less conformity and obedience, and greater individualism and independence. Now here we're comparing only 2nd-generation immigrants in the same European country. And in some analyses, which I'll show you in a second, we also compare, we hold the home country constant too. So we have mothers with different ethnicities who come from the same country and now live in the same European country. And we can identify off of that too. So we're able to hold constant all the usual stuff you might worry about. I'll draw your attention to feelings of being discriminated against. That holds constant, and I already mentioned that. Okay, I don't want to dilly-dally on this large, complicated regression plot, but you can see across 10 models, we always use the same models with the same controls. Pretty robust results for 2nd-generation immigrants in the expected direction. All right, zooming in on Italy. Now, Italy is interesting because, people tend to think of Italy as Catholic, but the northern and southern Italy have quite different histories in terms of church exposure. So northern Italy, the home of the Renaissance and banking and whatnot, was under the church from the earliest days, and it was part of the Carolingian Empire, which had a particularly strong historical effect. I made reference to the stuff in the marriage, in Catholic marriage. And in the south, some of the parts of the south, like Sicily, were under Islamic control for a while, and then also under the Byzantine Empire, which only had the marriage and family program light. So if we go back to using blood donations, we're using data from Italy's 93 provinces, we find that higher cousin marriage is associated with fewer blood donations, more corruption, less impersonal trust, measured as getting loans from friends versus banks, and keeping more wealth in cash and using fewer checks. So measures of impersonal trust, arguably. Okay, just to show you a little bit of the data. So more cousin marriage, fewer blood donations, and more cousin marriage, higher percentage of wealth in cash. We can also use checks and loans from friends and get the same answer. Now, not for blood donations, but for all the others, we can control for individual level income, wealth, and education. Using region fixed effects, so there's 20 regions, we can break it down and use fixed effects for that. We still get that result. Okay, so that's the basic psychological result, and we think that this variation in psychology is going to affect all kinds of things, which then affect economic outcomes. So now I'm looking at this paper that I'm working on with some colleagues. So Duman Barani Rod, Jonathan Beecham, and Jonathan Schultz. And there's two contributions I want to emphasize here. I'm not going to spend very long on this. It's still under production. But one, I'm going to show you a regression discontinuity analysis, which might alleviate concerns about causality here. There's reasons why I can argue the other makes a good case for causality, but the norms in economics kind of run against that, although that's not true in other disciplines. And the other thing I want to emphasize is getting to the kind of economic outcomes, so the kinds of things that more folks in the audience might care about. You might think that who cares about psychology, right? I'm just saying that's part of the story. Okay, so we use our kinship intensity measure, which I talked about earlier, and then we use the light luminosity, which many of you are probably familiar with, as a proxy for economic prosperity. And if we run the OLS, it's easy to show, looking at pixel level data on light intensity, that the kinship intensity index is associated with less light density, so less economic prosperity. We can include things like political hierarchies, which have previously been argued to affect luminosity, malaria index. We can have country fixed effects and continent fixed effects. And we get, well, the coefficient varies a lot, but we get at least robust significance across these different specifications. So that holds. And then I think the more interesting one is the regression discontinuity analysis. So this is a technique that was used by Mikolopoulos and Papayannou, and also used by Moscona and Nunn and colleagues. And so just giving you a basic bin scatter plot, this is distance to the border between two ethnic groups. So we have light luminosity on two sides of a border. We have some constraint that keeps us close to the border. So it's 200 kilometers is our kind of baseline. And then we compare the two groups on either side of the border and look to see if you have more light luminosity among the lower kinship groups. Yeah. So I think I labeled that wrong. So the groups with higher kinship intensity have lower light luminosity. Okay, so so here's the plot. Here's the regression discontinuity output. So greater KII, less log light density, which is our proxy for economic prosperity. And like I said, we can put in the usual controls. So that at least begins to make a better causal case than the kind of, what's your counter explanation approach that I was using above. All right, and now there's quite a bit of other evidence that one could point to, and different techniques to get at different kinds of concerns. So one of the things I did in the Weird People book was I looked at data from China and India that we have from the psychologist Thomas Talhelm, and since my graduate student Graham Noblet has worked on this. So here the idea is that, the church adds a lot of complexity. So let's look at when kinship intensity is affected by something else besides the church. So it's not like we think the only thing that matters for kinship intensity is the church. Lots of ecological variables are going to be important too. So anthropologists going back for a long time have argued that paddy rice agriculture is particularly conducive to intensive kinship. And in the China case, it's conducive to clans. So you can show the relationship, and this is actually what Graham Noblet has now provided good evidence for, is that more paddy rice agriculture, or even if you use the ecological variables that predict paddy rice agriculture, you can link that to clan intensity. And then what Thomas has shown is he links paddy rice agriculture to analytic thinking, self-concept, more individualistic self-concept, or in-group loyalty. And so the pattern that is suggested by this, although we don't have that link between kinship intensity and analytic and the psychology yet, is this linkage here, where paddy rice affects kinship intensity and kinship intensity affects features of psychology. The cool thing is you get the same result in India, which in China, there's a north-south gradient there, which would make you worry that other things are going on. But when you do it in India, it's an east-west gradient, and you get the same result. Graduate of Nathan's program over in economics at Harvard, Augustine Bergeron, did work in the DRC, and he used the historical location of Christian missions and then gathered data on people's kin networks and then gathered data on moral universalism and in-group loyalty. And he's able to draw links between being close to, well, it's actually even a cooler setup than that, because people are all living in the same city of Kananga, but they have natal homes and villages all around. So you use the distance from the natal village to the Christian mission, and you use that to see if you can predict their psychology living in the same city. And so he's able to establish links between proximity to historical Christian missions and a measure of kinship networks that fits with kinship intensity, and then link missions to these features of psychology. And then finally, economists from the University of British Columbia, Nash, Squires, and colleagues look at the US. And in the US, there were state laws. There's about 5% cousin marriage in the US on average. And states in different parts of the country, beginning with Kansas in 1858, I think, began to have state laws banning cousin marriage. And what they're able to show is that the state laws reduced kinship. And then they interact, the state laws, with last names that tended to have high or low amounts of cousin marriage. And then they're able to show that the longer you had this ban in your state, those with had high cousin marriage then go on to have more education and greater incomes. So we're able to link it to economic outcomes. So all this kind of together provides additional support for the role of kinship in affecting both psychology and economic outcomes. So let me close up here. One of the points I want to get across is there's a lot of psychological variation. So far in just this brief tour, I've just shown you this set, the set of aspects of psychology that's on the screen. There's also universalistic moral foundations, which I mentioned. There's the intentionality and moral judgments. There's differences in holistic versus analytic thinking. So just how people approach problems and how they begin to break it down. There's the guilt over shame that I mentioned. There's all the heuristics and biases. So something like the endowment effect, hunter-gatherers don't even have the endowment effect. Personality structure, so the big five, the kind of structure that if you tip into psychology, you learn about the big five. Some societies don't even have 5 traits and they don't match any of the ones on the big 5. So personality seems to be this very loose thing that's fitting to the social and economic structure of the society. And then finally, patience varies a lot. And there's lots of evidence to show that patience affects outcomes, although that depends on the details of the institutions. All right. Okay, and so then the last point I'll make here is just that the argument I make in the Weird People book is that this variation in psychology, individualism, trust, patience, time thrift, all these features of psychology that I discuss, then affected things like the functioning and growth of financial markets, rapid innovation that begins in Britain in 1750, the spread and interest in representative governments, and Protestantism. So it's key to understand the psychology to understand what institutions will emerge. Okay, so some take-home messages. So I think one of the things that I'm trying to do is advertise to you this approach coming from cultural evolution, where rather than saying people are rational, drawing on, claims from 19th century philosophy, we instead say, look, humans are an animal. We're a kind of ape, and we have a bunch of instincts associated with being an ape. But unlike other apes, we're heavily reliant on learning from others. And this gives rise to seemingly rational looking patterns because we're adaptive learners who key in on particular individuals and particular practices. We do weigh cost and benefit sometimes. So that can be put in there. And that these cultural learning abilities gives rise to social norms. That gives us a micro foundations for institutions. And we internalize those as one of our adaptations is to internalize social norms. There's a lot of evidence for that. And so a couple of key institutions that I think have gotten, well, the times are changing, but they certainly had traditionally got very little attention in economics, are kin-based institutions and religion. And in studying a course of human history, those seem to be two key things that really affect people's behavior. So institutions and psychology co-evolve because people's minds are adapting to the institutions they have to navigate. But then the psychology you end up with then affects which institutions are likely to spread. All right, that same point. So I've made the case, for example, that Western law and science is actually heavily affected by the fact that people were analytic thinkers, and they tended to think there were universal moral laws, which led them to think there were universal physical laws, and then universal legal laws. Something like representative government or human rights makes a lot more sense if you think of individuals as being endowed with certain properties, which not everybody thinks. I mean, the cross-cultural evidence is clear on that. Okay, and then finally, I would make the case that economics could be better at addressing the problems it's trying to solve if it was more of a evolutionary, historical, and psychological science. All right, that's everything.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe, for this fascinating tour de force over the history of human development. Nathan, please go ahead.
Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen. Let me know if not. So yeah, I'm super excited to say a few words on Joe's book, and I'll try and keep this under 10 minutes. And so what I really want to do in this talk is to really just connect this or provide some comments and thoughts about why this is particularly relevant for development economists. So I think Joe did an excellent job of summarizing his book. There's a few important things is that we are weird. So I'll come back to this. We're outliers. Those of us that are, I think, probably most of us here who are from weird societies. The fact that we're weird has historical origins, right? And so the medieval church's marriage and family program, and this is what Joe's book's about, it broke down kinship ties, created a particular psychology. The other thing is that culture and psychology is central, and this was hugely important for economic prosperity. Okay. The one other point I want to make is that this is a sequel to Joe's earlier book, The Secret of Our Success, which he mentioned. And for those of you that haven't read either book, or maybe one or the other, I would make a big pitch for that book. It's more foundational. I think Joe wrote it because it provides the building blocks, which are very standard in his discipline of evolutionary anthropology. And so it's more foundational. And although it's more standard in his discipline, I think it's even more insightful in our discipline, for our discipline, just because there are these basic insights, which I don't think we've come to understand. So read both, definitely. Within economics, there is literature. So if you want to think about what are the connections to economics, Joe did an even better job in this slide, but I just want to put some of these up here. And in particular, Jonathan is here in the audience. He's at the conference. So if you want to learn more about this area, Jonathan Schultz is a person to talk to. Martine here with this paper here is also another person to talk to. And then the other thing too is this connects to things that you might not know or think that it connects to. So rugged individualism, which is closely connected to individualism, it explains, why do Americans love guns, for example. This paper in the JPE by Ben Enke, why did Trump get elected? right? So these are things that you might not naturally make these connections, but they're kind of important even to our daily lives today. So what's the relevance for development economics? So yeah, Joe and I have talked about this. I think this is an open question, or at least in my book. What does this imply for economic development moving forward? So we've heard all of this. I 100% believe it. It's that weird culture and psychology, which was historically shaped, is important, is first order for economic development. So there's two answers, but what now? Let's move forward, right? So half the world, or some chunk of the world is very prosperous, less than half, I guess. But a big chunk of the world is still extremely poor. So one answer is less developed countries need to follow the same path. They need to break down kinship ties. We need to lower the size of families, reduce cousin marriage, et cetera, et cetera. Think individualistically, not holistically. Think analytically, not holistically. The other answer is actually the process of development, including policies, things we do to help countries, things they do to help themselves, has to look very different, because we're weird. We had a particular history. We have this weird psychology. We had a particular path, but we also know that we're outliers, right? So the path of the rest of the world has to look very different. Okay, and so this is crucial. The book, I think, shows that this is crucial. And the question here is, by default, are we implicitly assuming number one? Just because we, as Western researchers, as weird researchers, weird policymakers, aren't thinking about this question, and they're just presuming it's number one. In part, we don't even understand or know the difference, this cultural or psychological difference, which is an important part of Joe's book. So let me just give you a few examples. So how do we view population, right? So I've been in many focus groups where you try and explain the economist logic. Oh, if you have less children, then you can educate them more, right? Isn't that a good thing? Why do you still have 8, 10, 12 children? And the answer, at least in the places I work with in Africa, is, oh, you just don't understand. Like, wealth is not money, like in the solo model, Y over L. If wealth is Y over L, and that's individualistic money to some extent, per capita income, then you want to decrease L, right, in the solo model, or the rate of population growth, if you want to go back to the solo model. But wealth is in people, right? Wealth is having a large lineage. Wealth is having a large family. So, I've heard people say, part of the reason why you have large families, it's not your own, personal greed or anything like this. It's because it's your duty to help contribute to the vibrancy of the lineage, right? It's your duty to have cousins for your other cousins, et cetera, or for your nieces and nephews. So that's a very different model, right? And there is an older anthropological literature talking about how wealth and people is the worldview there. This is related, so it's not something obscure. It's related to the Lewis model. The Lewis model, what happened? People had children beyond the subsistence being the marginal product of labor. They had children until they couldn't feed them anymore, till the subsistence equaled the average product of labor, average labor. So it's super important. And so what does this mean for policies? So we have a lot of policies that are trying to promote family planning, a lot of them which are actually quite intrusive. So both of these figures up here, this is from India and this is from North America. Both of these are, well, let me just say, India and North America are both places that had forced sterilization in the 1970s. So this is within my lifetime. So this is the emergency program in India in the 70s. And then here, this is a pamphlet to try and coerce individuals who are of indigenous ancestry to have less children. In both cases, they associate smaller families with prosperity, right? So smaller families, you have more horses. Smaller families, you have a nicer house, a tractor in the background, okay? So how much of this view basically relies on our implicit weird assumptions, right? If wealth is in people, you're going to have a very different view of the world. And interesting, this ties to economics. So the wealth and people view has a logic, right? And this is found in Joe's book. This is the collective brain. Because we are social learners, we learn from one another. When you have more people, there's more learning. Also, when you have more people, you draw from a larger N, the Einsteins or the leaders, and they're going to teach others, right? And so there is a logic to it, actually. Scale effects, endogenous growth, Paul Romer, exactly the same thing, right? And so these are, I think, things we need to be thinking about rather than just presuming the path that Western Europe took is the path that developing countries took. Another example is secure property rights, right? So naturally, with the goal of economic development in mind, we want to privatize land. We want to create markets for land. We know those are missing in different countries like Africa. But this, when you stop and think about it, and Joe's work highlights this, this is really built on weird assumptions. The individuals or even groups, so corporations which form, should own land, and ownership equals the right to sell equals the right to use, okay? But this isn't the only way to view land and ownership. And so here's another way of thinking about it. It's not an individual that owns land, but a lineage. And a lineage is past and future generations, right? So it's not an individual, even individuals that are owned. And so those that are alive today, they're the custodians over this land or this property, right? And they need to maintain it for future generations. They need to not disgrace past generations by doing something that they wouldn't like. So no individual or group of individual has the right to buy or sell land, right? So if we're promoting that, what does that mean if people have these deeply held, almost spiritual beliefs about what land is? And then ownership isn't synonymous with use rights, actually. Okay, and so why is this important? So for 25% of the world's land mass, basically individuals subsist by pastoralism, basically animal husbandry, but animal husbandry where the animals move seasonally, so transhumance, so that they go to the locations where plant matter is available, right? So you can imagine if you have private ownership, this system, which is actually very environmentally sustainable, very environmentally efficient, is going to handle climate change quite well, isn't going to work well. So what's happening now in many parts of the world, land's being privatized and these traditional routes and these traditional use rights are being disrupted, right? And so that's another example. Is it true that private property equals good institutions? So much since Asimov with Johnson Robinson, we talk about good institutions, bad institutions, with this very kind of this vertical view, and stronger property rights are good institutions. So should we think more deeply than that on this? So just the last thing I want to talk about, or second to last thing, is what does this mean for policy? So some have argued or are worried that because of the long run evolutionary historical processes Joe laid out, this means there's no role for policies, no role for randomization, for evaluation. So it's actually not at all true. It's actually quite the opposite. So I think Joe's work shows how a policy can be so effective that it affects the whole world effectively, or the whole world, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So our policies can have effects. And the other thing is these were consequences that were completely unintended by the church, right? During the medieval period. They weren't foreseen hundreds of years into the future, into the Industrial Revolution. So to some extent, our worry is that policies are too effective in the sense that they're doing things that we don't want them to do, or we're not even thinking about that they're going to do years into the future, or their effects that we're not even thinking about. There's many, many examples of this, of policies. So effectively development policies, aid policies in the past having effects. So Diego's here, for example, if you want to ask him about his great paper. Other work, Marcy Alsad, Sarah Lowe's, Eduardo Montero, Monica Martinez Bravo, just examining many aspects of this, right? And so what are the longer term unintended cultural effects of all these interventions that are going on today, right? The interventions that we're putting in the field tomorrow. And if we're just thinking about this, this is, this well-known paper by Renika and Jakob Svensson, just reminding us that the rates of capture are extremely high in most aid programs. This is all educational expenditures within sub-Saharan Africa. And the rate of capture was, in these cases where they're able to measure them, were extremely, extremely high, right? So there's other, our efforts are going to places other than where they're intended. And so the very last point is, which is provocative, but I'm actually, I don't know if this is true, but I think we should seriously consider it. So weird psychology, and Joe mentioned this, allowed Western Europe to dominate the rest of the world. Empire building, colonialism, the slave trade, enslavement, This benefited Western European cultures for sure, but it definitely came at the cost of other cultures. So all the cultures that were decimated, for example, indigenous populations around the world, those that were enslaved, etc. So weird psychology is optimal. The regressions show that for sure, right? In terms of increasing income per capita for those societies that have the weird psychology. But is it socially optimal in the sense of, is it optimal for the world, for the globe, right? It's optimal for the cultures that adopt it, but is it also optimal for those other cultures that were dominated? And why is this important? Well, because I think, like, looking in the future, how successful is weird psychology going to be in solving the problems of the future, which are all about the world as a whole, about spillovers, externalities, things like climate change, social conflict, health crises. And one way to think of this is weird psychology is very analytic. That's what we're really good at, right? And Joe mentioned this, this distinction, analytic versus holistic thinking. We're very good at thinking about ourselves. We're less good at thinking about how we are in relation to others in society, how we fit in, externalities, these sorts of things, right? So it may be good for the prosperity of weird cultures. Is it good for the prosperity of society as a whole? And then this is related to answer 1 and 2 about what should our path be moving forward. Should we be promoting non-weird cultures to being weird, or should we be changing the way we think of development as weird cultures? So I'll stop there, and so we have time for questions, but a fantastic book. There's a lot to think about. And just the last point is, we as researchers moving forward, we're the outliers. We're the weird ones. Even though we're dominating economic development, we're dominating economic development research. So I think this and the 2 paths forward in terms of development suggests that we need to be much, much more inclusive, and to at least think of other paths of development, other ways of viewing the world. Yeah, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Nathan. There's a lot of food for thought, I think. I hope other people see as well how these approaches are expanding our horizon and providing new insights for development economic research. So thank you so much, Joe and Nathan. We have about 10 minutes for questions. So let me actually start with Dilip's question. So Dilip is wondering, in the spirit of Nathan's comment, what Joe thinks of the development success of China and East Asian societies based on clan societies, especially projecting into the future. Do you want to take this question, or should I add another question and then you respond in whatever order or whatever emphasis you'd like?
I'd like to just take it.
Go ahead.
All right. So I think this, yeah, so I think this actually dovetails nicely with some of the stuff that Nathan said. Thanks a lot, by the way, Nathan. So China and, well, so let's start with Japan. So people don't often realize that in the Meiji Restoration in the 1880s, Japan began taking in a lot of European civil codes. So it gets cousin marriage and rules against polygyny and stuff in the 1880s. And then subsequent, you know, the case needs to be made that then had subsequent impacts on the economic development experienced in Japan. But that's one of the oldest Asian societies that took in civil codes that were first forged in the West. China adopts European civil codes in now 1950. And, you know, in typical China style, a very top-down state effort to burn lineages, end uncle-niece marriage, and cousin marriage doesn't get banned until 1980. But bilateral inheritance begins to be enforced, and that's adopted in the 1960s in South Korea. So there's just a whole bunch of things that come in the form of civil law that get imported into China and whatnot. But then what you see, and I think this is really important, and gets to Nathan's point, is not just societies following the Western pathway, but like in Japan, for example, they adopted a lot of US institutions after World War II. But if you look at how their legal system works, it doesn't actually work like the institutions like the American system does. So if Americans sue each other all the time, but Japanese very rarely sue each other. And so just the way the system functions is different because it's a somewhat different pathway where folks have a different psychology. And so the formal institution doesn't work the same way. And I think China's on another third path. It's, you know, it obviously doesn't look Western European, but it's also different than pre-1950, the Chinese history before the importation of all these institutions.
Thank you. I'd like to pose a question. It's kind of a big question with a few parts, so feel free to take whatever seems interesting. So in the description of historical development that you sketched today, there's this very stark change between the kin-based tied societies with pair bonding and so on, and the individualistic societies that we see in parts of the world today. It's really like this individualism is really in some ways kind of like the opposite image of those tied bonds. And then I wonder if you can elaborate on the role of culture and institutions. You make this very intriguing claim that this sort of like dichotomy between culture and institutions is false. And I find that, analyzing the connections is super interesting. But I also, I personally, perhaps because of my own bias, tend to think of these as distinct, not independent, but distinct. So it's just, institutions as formal rules and culture as social norms, rules of thumb, and so on. And if you think of the concrete case that you emphasize so compellingly of the church and how this broke these strong ties of kinship, if you go to this, what you describe about marriage, like there are these rules, and then there's how people behave around those rules. And but I find it fascinating, like how did this start? Like, the church came and set up these new institutions. Where did this come from? Was there some kind of like cultural background that made these particular institutions establish these rules? And then there's this feedback. And I also wondered if, this distinction between shame and guilt, I was wondering if the church was also instrumental in creating guilt. There's kind of like an echo of this notion of the impartial spectator that goes back to Adam Smith, of like people getting something in their head that's kind of like regulating their behavior. And I also wondered if this, prevalence of guilt is connected with the intentionality of moral judgment that you emphasize. So feel free to take any.
So, I think that we really need to spend more time shining a spotlight on so my picture is that people have preferred ways of doing things, and they have the social norms that govern their lives and kinship systems and stuff. But then they have political institutions. So say you're at a small charter town in medieval Europe, you've started it, now you got to decide, how are we going to run our town? And so that's the time when you have to start making the rules, and which particular rules you pick can then create this kind of interactive process. So I guess the distinction I want to make is really between the creation of formal institutions or formal organizations and the kind of informal institutions that all human societies have. And then, of course, the kinds of rules and stuff that you're going to like, for example, these medieval towns had notions of citizens' rights. So they were endowing individuals, not families, not lineages, with certain rights that you get as joining the town. And different towns in different parts of Germany and other places started having these charters where they would write down what these rights are. And then people were self-selecting, right? So the towns are competing for the best merchants and the best blacksmiths and whatnot. And so the towns that became successful, other towns started copying their charters. So you get this evolutionary process where you're getting towns that are better at generating wealth by pulling, the best, merchants or whatever, and generating economic prosperity. So you have this kind of evolutionary dynamic in the emergence of those institutions. But the case I make, this is all in the background of a world of individuals, where individuals can move to new towns. We could have a lineage law where we're going to regulate lineages, but there weren't any lineages because the church had dispensed with them. So you just get a different evolutionary process there. But yeah, and so Tim Beasley and Torsten Peterson and Patrick Francois have all built models where you have this kind of interactive dynamic, where you have some types or preferences or something, and then people are making a decision, and then the decision feeds back. So I think some of the basic theoretical tools are there. We just haven't built very many of those models. Oh, and then the guilt shame one. Can you remind me what the question was?
I was just wondering if the shift from shame to guilt is also connected to the church, and if the sort of like the doctrine of the church kind of like directly promotes it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I don't know of anything that would satisfy the quantitative demands of economists, but there's certainly literature within history suggesting that the church became obsessed with sin. So there's a book called From Shame to Sin, and it's really from shame to guilt, where they begin, putting the burden on the individual, feeling that private sense of sin in the eyes of God. So that may have pushed this guilt thing along.
Thank you, Joe. Garance, you have a question or a comment, please go ahead.
Yes, very related to the points that Nathan brought up, and fascinating talk. It just, when you talk about public good contribution and being good, I was wondering whether there's a sense where once you put the formal institution going beyond the clan, you're getting really good at getting organized for the town, for the small group, but also better at taking from others, benefiting your city as opposed to other city, being able to push your people at a wider sense than just the lineage and the clan, so you do better, but at taking from others, which bring us to climate, or bring us to a lot of very large public good, where it's really not clear to me that culture is going to help at all to contribute to the public good as a large, so that you become good at helping a wider circle than just your clan, which makes you more effective, but that's at the cost of everybody else.
Yeah, and that dynamic that you described is central to my thinking, in the sense that cooperation at a smaller level is called corruption. So it all depends on the kind of level at which you're cooperating at. And one of the reasons why voluntary associations are so important is that you might be a member of this group one day, but 2 years from now, you might be a member of a different group. And so you're moving around. If you have centralized groups where people can't switch, then you really want to invest in that group, because you're never going to find yourself in another group. So I think that's part of the dynamic that's going on.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're actually right on time to wrap up. I want to really emphatically thank Joe and Nathan for joining us today. This was fascinating. We are delighted to that we had the chance to have you in the conference. So thank you so much, and thanks to everyone that joined us this morning. We have a full day of presentations ahead, so I'll wrap up now, but thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nathan. Thanks, Martine.
Okay, have a nice day.
Great. Thanks.
Bye, Nathan. Thank you.
Yeah, great seeing you.